risks through geoengineering, opportunities and challenges. For this, we are very happy to welcome Dr. Jesse Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds is an Emmett Frankel Fellow in Environmental Law and Policy at the UCLA School of Law and an associate researcher at the Utrecht University Center for Water, Oceans, and Sustainability Law, and a research affiliate at Harvard's Solar Geoengineering Research Program. Dr. Reynolds is also author of the recently published book, The Governance of Solar Geoengineering, Managing Climate Change in the Anthropocene. I'd also like to mention that his book is free online via academic institutions via Cambridge University Press. So if you're with an academic institution, I encourage you to check it out for free. We're also very pleased to have three discussants join us today who will be offering their comments after Jesse gives his talk. Our first discussant is Juan Moreno Cruz, who is an associate professor with the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development and Canada Research Chair at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. Our second discussant is David McAvoy, who is Professor of Economics and Associate Dean for Undergraduate Programs and Administration at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. And our third discussant is Maria Belaya, a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard John Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and an affiliate of the Harvard Environmental Economics program at Harvard Kennedy School. Before I begin, I would like to thank today's event co-sponsors, namely the Duke Initiative on Science and Society, as well as the Environmental Institutions Seminar, which is convened regularly by the Nicholas School of the Environment, the Sanford School of Public Policy, and the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, all here at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. After Jesse's talk, we will have reactions from our discussants and responses from Jesse. We will also try to get to as many questions as possible that have been submitted by our attendees already, and I thank you all for that. You may also submit your questions as they happen via the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. With that, I'd like to thank you all for attending, and Jesse, the floor is yours, and you may begin to share your slides. Thank you.
Great, thank you for the kind introduction, Tyler. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm gonna hop over here to start sharing my screen and dive right into my presentation. All right, can you, Tyler, can you see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as Tyler said, the context of thinking about geoengineering is climate change. And a useful way to think about how people think about climate change was put forth by Robert Socolow with this 2x2 matrix, asking whether climate change is or is not an urgent problem and whether ending greenhouse gas emissions is or is not difficult. And if it's not an urgent problem and it's not difficult, then we don't have anything to worry about. Whatever problem there is will solve itself. If climate change is not an urgent problem, but ending emissions is difficult, one finds the domain of climate change skeptics and deniers. Many, if not most, environmentalists would say that climate change is an urgent problem, and an energy transition and other ways of ending greenhouse gas emissions is not that difficult. But what if we're here? What if climate change is an urgent problem, which I'll assume from here on forward, but what if ending greenhouse gas emissions is in fact quite difficult? We need to talk about that. And here's one way we can look at it. This graph is, it's somewhat messy, but it is a time series. Time is the bottom axis, and the vertical axis is greenhouse gas emissions, in this case, carbon dioxide, the most important greenhouse gas. And the various lines that scatter off are the top level scenarios that have been used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the leading scientific assessment body. And you can see that these spread out starting around 1990, which is when the first IPCC report came out. And the four fat lines are the main scenarios that are currently in use. The black dots are actual greenhouse gas emissions, or should I say actual carbon dioxide emissions to be precise. And one message that I take away from this is that actual emissions have tended toward the pessimistic side of projections of the future. But what about the future from here on forward? Well, if we want to stay within the 2-degree warming target that countries agreed upon in the Paris Agreement and not rely on large-scale carbon dioxide removal, then future emissions need to do something like this. They need to go to zero around 2050, 2060 or so, something like that. The Paris Agreement operates in a 5-year cycle of where countries make their own commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if countries keep their first round of emission targets, then future carbon dioxide emissions would go upward along those lines. And finally, a recent paper asked several dozen climate change experts, where do you think emissions will be at the end of this century? And the median answer was about 60 gigatons per year, looking something like that. So all this points toward an indication that ending greenhouse gas emissions is difficult. But why is that? I think a lot of it can be explained by looking at the incentives that the relevant actors face, the emitters, people, businesses, countries. Cutting greenhouse gas emissions creates net global benefits. The global benefits of avoided climate change are greater than the costs of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Those benefits are spread out across the world. The costs are borne by the local actor, if you will, the company or the country. So what ends up happening is at the local level, the costs outweigh the benefits, so you have net costs. And you have a disconnect between what's in the interest of the collective and what's in the interest of the individual. And this is a classic collective action problem, which requires cooperation with a capital C from the game theoretic sense of the word. And what instead of collective action, instead of cooperation, what one can expect is a lot of so-called free riding, where the individuals don't do what's in the collective interest, instead they do what's in their individual interest, and one would expect suboptimal action, in this case, action being reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that's exactly what we've seen. And I think that goes a long way toward explaining why emissions have remained high, probably will remain high, and why we're in that bottom right quadrant from Sokolow, and why we need to take solar geoengineering seriously. What is solar geoengineering? Well, the idea, the leading idea at least, is inspired by volcanic eruptions, which naturally cool the planet by releasing a fine powder that lingers in the atmosphere for months or a year or so and cools the planet naturally. So some scientists and others are wondering whether we could replicate this effect and somehow artificially cooling the planet. And one possible method to do so would be to mimic volcanoes and inject an aerosol, a fine mist, into the stratosphere. That's an upper layer of the atmosphere, where the mist would linger and block a small portion of incoming sunlight and cool the planet. A few characteristics of solar geoengineering are, first, at a sort of a gross level, it would work. There's agreement that stratospheric aerosol injection and perhaps other forms of solar geoengineering could cool the planet. Here the IPCC says down to 1.5 degrees warming, but really could as well go to pre-industrial conditions, if not cooler. It seems technically feasible. There's no obvious barriers to conveying substances into the stratosphere, for example. It appears to have remarkably low direct financial costs of implementation, low in terms of climate change economics. And we'll get back to the importance of this in a moment, of this characteristic. It is, as it's understood, it's necessarily global in effect. There's no understanding right now of effective regional solar geoengineering. And importantly, the idea is to complement, not substitute for emissions reduction. In the long term, emissions must be reduced and eliminated. But if that's insufficient, then solar geoengineering could act as a complementary risk management tool. And this is the opportunity that my title speaks of with solar geoengineering. It could, it appears, greatly reduce climate change and its impacts. But it also poses quite a number of serious environmental risks and social challenges, as I like to call them. But really, these challenges are along a spectrum where you have relatively risks that are entirely environmental, impacts on stratospheric ozone and precipitation anomalies, for example, local areas that are too wet or too dry, and some social challenges that are largely or entirely social in nature, such as ethical concerns. And so what we have is a classic risk-risk trade-off. There is no wonderful path forward, no ideal path forward. It's an opportunity to reduce one risk, but it brings risks of its own. And some of these are quite serious. And the one that I'm going to talk about for the rest of my presentation today is this one, decision-making. Who decides whether and how solar geoengineering might be used? And once again, to think about this, how this might play out, we can look at the incentives that actors face. Like emissions reduction, solar geoengineering, from a climatic perspective, could create great benefits globally of reduced climate change, and those would be greater. Those would be greater than the costs, posing net benefits. The difference arises in that, as I mentioned, the financial costs of implementation seem so low that for at least some larger countries, their localized benefits of avoided climate change might be greater than the cost of undertaking solar geoengineering, even for the whole world. So the problem is much different than cutting greenhouse gas emissions. On the one hand, it doesn't have that collective action problem, but it does have different problems. And I'd like to categorize these into two boxes. First is a concern around too soon. That is, a country or other actor may rush ahead forward and use or implement solar geoengineering before there's an international consensus to do so. And as I said, it's necessarily global in effect, so this could create a number of problems, challenges internationally. And the other category is too much. If solar geoengineering is inexpensive, then perhaps once it's begun, it would be done at an excessive level. Let's take each of these two categories in a little bit more detail. Let's look at the too soon, which is really a question of whether to do solar geoengineering. Let me start off by saying that some observers have speculated that non-state actors could implement solar geoengineering. I don't see that as a very feasible or likely outcome for a variety of reasons. I think the only actors that are probable to do so are countries, states, as they're called sometimes in international relations. So we now enter into the domain of international relations, international politics, and international law. And in that context, the international order is governed first and foremost by sovereignty. States have wide latitude and a great amount of freedom with the activities that they undertake, certainly within their national borders, but also, for example, in the high seas. And this can be limited, for example, through international law, but in the international order, treaties are voluntary. They're not imposed upon countries. Countries agree to a treaty. So this creates a challenge of how states might restrain themselves. How could the international community restrain those states that might be tempted to rush ahead, as it were, and use solar geoengineering before there's an international consensus? Let's look at three categories of states, rough categories, as a way to organize our thinking. The first of which I call the responsible states, in quotes. And by this, I mean those countries that are well integrated into the international order. They cooperate, for the most part, with international institutions and agreements, et cetera. Although one of them might be tempted to rush ahead in this way, this strikes me as the type of a temptation that such countries could collectively manage. And this does not seem to me to be an area of significant concern. The second category are rogue and climate vulnerable states. By the former, I mean those countries that are really on the fringes of the international order and tend to not cooperate with international institutions and processes. And other states might be relatively small developing countries that are highly vulnerable to climate change. Such countries might be tempted to use solar geoengineering. On the one hand, I think the feasibility of them doing so is constrained by capacity. Climate engineering, solar geoengineering might be relatively inexpensive and technically feasible, but doing so in an effective way is still beyond the technical capacity and the budgets of many of the smaller states. On the other hand, they might attempt solar geoengineering in a suboptimal way, in kind of a sloppy way, as a way to perhaps reduce local short-term climate impacts, or as a means toward a means of protest, a means of trying to instigate climate action more generally, adaptation funding and emissions cuts globally. Could the international community constrain this? My sense is it largely could through the traditional means of linking issues, side payments, that is carrots, and threats, sticks, and such potential use of solar geoengineering by rogue states and climate vulnerable states seems to me something that the international community could constrain. Not necessarily, though. I think India is an outlier in this regard. It's vulnerable to climate change. It has great technical capacity. It's at an optimal latitude to conduct solar geoengineering, stratospheric aerosol injection specifically, and it could present its own set of problems. And then finally, are hegemons, superpowers, and constraining the behavior of hegemons is really difficult, not just in solar geoengineering, in all sorts of issues. In large part because if they're interested in conducting solar geoengineering, they have no incentive to endorse and ratify an agreement to constrain their own power. It's very difficult to arrange their incentives, so it is in their interest. So efforts towards an international agreement in this regard might turn out to be futile. One last thing I want to say about unilateral implementation of solar geoengineering is it might not necessarily be harmful. I mean, it certainly is an affront to ideas of legitimacy in the international order. But from another perspective, in terms of reducing the risks of climate change, there are scenarios in which unilateral solar geoengineering could break through a logjam of international climate change politics and facilitate action. On to the second set of questions, the how questions. This is the concern around maybe we'd get too much solar geoengineering. So imagine, let's assume that there's some sort of international consensus that solar geoengineering should be used, and it is being used. Then the questions are what method should be used, at what intensity, who undertakes it, where, at what time of year, etc. And such questions are a type of a coordination problem. Countries should get on the same page, as it were. And for the most part, they probably can. These are the types of questions that are amenable to compromise. And even if compromise is not possible, some gap between where countries are, if they're not all on the same page, are not necessarily detrimental. So these are coordination problems, not cooperation problems. And in this way, these sorts of questions are very different than whether to use solar geoengineering. At the same time, what must be borne in mind is that it's something of an asymmetrical issue. Solar geoengineering, as it's understood, is additive. A country or other actor can put greater quantities of material into the atmosphere, but they're unable to remove the materials that other actors, other countries have put into the atmosphere. So those countries that might want a cooler planet, more solar geoengineering, have greater negotiation power. But would there be disagreement? This is a serious question. On the one hand, if there was agreement on the climate targets, if the world agreed to go to pre-industrial conditions as best as possible, or to go to 1.5 to 2 degrees warming as set out in the Paris Agreement, then modeling suggests that there would not be much disagreement on the parameters of solar geoengineering. Right? So if there was agreement on the temperature target, to use the most important climate variable, then that could probably be achieved. But we don't know what states' preferences are. We don't know the distribution of their preferences. Would countries agree on the optimal global climate, or would there be widespread disagreement? Would the hotter countries want a cooler planet and the cooler countries want a warmer planet, for example? We also don't know the intensity of states' preferences. Is this the type of issue that states will perceive as central to their a central issue, or something that's sort of a second-tier priority that they'd like to see go their way, but not necessarily so? Regardless, how might such a process play out where countries are negotiating and seeing how to proceed in this coordination problem? And I turn to the example of monetary policy, where countries already make decisions that have effects on other countries in an asymmetrical way. That is, stronger countries affect weaker countries through monetary policy. And there's a fair amount of uncertainty in the process, not complete uncertainty. What do we see? Well, within countries, we can see that decision-making, that elected officials set the broadest contours of policy, of the targets of shall we say, inflation and unemployment, where experts that are fairly politically isolated set the parameters and implement this policy. We might see a similar thing with solar geoengineering. And internationally, an institution like the IMF is not a centralized decision-making body. Instead, it's a loose coordinating body that conducts research and provides a forum for sharing information, etc. That might be an effective model for thinking about how the international community might proceed with the details of climate engineering. So to wrap up, a couple of take-home messages. Solar geoengineering has the potential to reduce climate change. It appears according to models and natural analog. That's the opportunity, but it poses real environmental risks and social challenges. This could play out in a number of undesirable ways. And you know, when we start talking about governance, this is difficult. But the fact of the matter is we're in a risk-risk trade-off. So any statement about the difficulty of governance must be made relative. Compared to what? And when I look at the incentive structure and the characteristics of solar geoengineering, it seems to me that that this is less challenging than the type of governance that would be necessary to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to keep warming within 2 degrees. And it also strikes me as a type of easier than the type of governance that would be necessary in a world of 3 or 4 degrees warming, which is what we're on track to hit at the end of this century. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jesse. That was very interesting. A lot of food for thought, especially that last one. I hadn't thought about whether the governance issues are less complicated for solar geoengineering than they are for mitigation. We'll now move on to our discussant reactions, and we'll start with Juan Moreno Cruz.
Hello. Can you see me? I don't know.
Yes, we can see and hear you.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Jesse. This was really good. I think a really good introduction to the complexities of the problem and a really interesting approach to thinking about governance. I want to follow with a general intervention about the way we think about geoengineering and the way that Jesse actually discussed it in this talk, and then address some ideas specific to what Jesse talked about today. Generally, I think taking the description of geoengineering or solar geoengineering that Jesse took, we picture a sort of intervention that is global, that is large, and that is achieved through international coordination. there is an alternative way to think about geoengineering, and it is one in which we have different actors intervening with the climate in small ways, maybe coordinated or not. But the concept of geoengineering, solar geoengineering that we have in mind, seems to have this monolithic approach in which we just have one technology. We're just going to pick one and we're going to put it up there and we're going to see how we coordinate that. But the reality is that there are several techniques that we don't know about yet, that they're actually going to show up. And countries are going to be able to actually do a little bit of, could be able to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, whatever works. The important thing here is that the impacts are still global. So even though your intervention is local, which means you have jurisdiction over it, the impacts can also be global. So that is a different way to think about the technology, a different way to think about governance, because now we are thinking of the problem with international governance, as Jesse said, is that we don't have this international body that can actually enforce behavior. But if it is within your jurisdiction, as it has been planned and discussed in Australia, for example, there is very little the international community can do. And I think a lot could happen in those ways. So I think we need to start to think about geoengineering as a more, as a less monolithic way, a large technology. We have to think about it in the way it actually could be used. But this is not bad, because in a recent work with my longtime co-author, Kate Rickey, we started to think of something that we call geoengineering wedges. This idea that you can have small slivers of different technologies that, when add up, reach the same level of cooling as you would do with like a large intervention. But the reason why this is not, this idea of wedges is better, is because the actual risks come from the level of implementation. I'm talking about this climate and natural risk. It's not just that we do it or not, it's if we do too much. But we can control the small interventions better than we can control large interventions. I think that is an important distinction to make, and that creates new challenges for governance, but it can also aid. Because now we're not thinking of a large intervention that we need to figure out. We're thinking about, hey, this didn't work, we can shut it off. Or maybe this one is working better. So if we achieve the same level of cooling, but we do it with fewer large interventions, more of little interventions, then that would be great. So something, just food for thought on that one. And the second part that I want to address, it really gets to Jesse's idea, and really cool division of too soon and too much questions. I think that is really nice. And I'm going to use this to actually very quickly talk about the endpoint. So what is our endpoint when we talk about geoengineering intervention? There are two ways that we can think about the future. One way is we are going to do this forever and ever. And we are not going to do about mitigation, and we have to do solar geoengineering as much as we can for as long as possible before something collapses. That end world is possible. We don't know. There is another one in which we use it and then we stop using it. Yeah, we use it for a little bit. We use it for as long as is required until we get mitigation and carbon dioxide removal going, and then we stop using it. So let's assume that that is our endpoint, that we really don't want to deal with geoengineering forever and ever. So we are going to do intervention of geoengineering with the goal of stopping at some point. So once we have that as our endpoint, the question is like, how do we decide that? And in that sense, I bring the same questions. What is too soon? And what is too much? Too much in this case is too fast. So who decides when to stop? Who decides how fast to stop? And what is the indications that tell us, hey, we should be stopping geoengineering at this point or at this rate? So now we have those questions at the end. And I think those questions at the end are not independent of the initial question of when do we start? Yeah, so I think the governance literature so far in geoengineering treats the start question independent of the ending question. And again, like I said before, this actually makes the problem more complicated, because if you design a governance structure that tells you when to stop, intrinsically that makes the governance question more manageable, because you are constantly asking when I'm going to stop, when I'm going to stop, when I'm going to stop. And that is not even the beginning. The first question that we need to ask is how much research to do and when to do it. And in that case, we also have a too soon and too much question. So the question of research also matters, and it matters in the sense that how much research should we be doing, yeah, and when should we start to do a particular sort of research, let's say, that is actual on the field. So in terms of governance, I think we're making a mistake by not thinking of the governance of research, deployment, and stopping together. And I don't know how to think about this, and that's why I'm asking this question right now, so that we can talk about it. But I think thinking of the governance structure as the whole process since we start doing research until we stop using geoengineering might be a fruitful area of research in the future, and hopefully something that Jesse can comment on. So thank you.
Thank you, Juan. That was great. Two very important points. And as we agreed earlier, Jesse will respond to all of our discussants collectively. So we'll next go to Dave McAvoy. Dave?
Thank you. And thank you, Jesse, for a great talk and introduction to some of the big issues here. So I'll react to a couple of things that you said that caught my interest, and then kind of introduce a couple questions a little broader that I've had triggered by a lot of your work. The first is you dismissed, and rightly so, I'm sure, the non-state actors. You know, from my reading of some of these technologies is that we have a subset of people in the world and in this country that are extremely wealthy, that some of these technologies are cheap enough and people may be fed up enough, and there's enough crowdsourcing options and ways that it could be private enterprise or corporations or individuals. And so I'm kind of curious why that doesn't loom a little bit larger. And if it did, how it would potentially impact international negotiations or treaties that would deal with solar or geoengineering in general. And part of that is one of the early pieces that I read on geoengineering was framed as you know, a private company kind of, you know, coming up with the technology, which isn't odd, but even contemplating that it could be used by non-state actors. The second reaction was on kind of the ease of the issue in terms of governance. And one of the things that you mentioned is that if there can be an agreement on the target, right? So if the collective, the international community, the global community can kind of agree on the target, then agreeing on the parameters may be pretty easy. And I'm wondering why that might be the case with geoengineering, but it's different from agreeing on a target with mitigation. And is it because that, you know, there's only so far we can go with emissions abatement, but with geoengineering, we could go, you know, countries could go a lot farther and make, you know, even more dramatic differences in the global climate. So that kind of sparked my interest. And another couple things that I want to just quickly mention is there's a lot of, you know, there's mention in the book on the moral hazard issue, and moral hazard being one of the things that, one of the reasons that people and institutions and countries may be reluctant to explore geoengineering. And just kind of try to get your thoughts on, is this as big of a deal as we make that out to be? Some of the research that's out there the little research that's out there, but some of the research suggests that maybe it isn't. Maybe we see a reverse moral hazard. And so I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that problem. And finally, and Juan kind of ended with this, is about the research. And there are all kinds of different agenda or research agenda that we could explore. I kind of want to get your thoughts on the role of behavioral or social scientists in this area moving forward. What are the good questions to be working on? But thank you again.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate that. We'll go now to Maria.
Hi, thanks Jesse a lot. I always enjoy it. It's a very eloquent talk. And I love your book. I want to suggest anyone who haven't read it yet to go for it. So thanks also guys for sort of mentioning. I was going to talk about non-state actors too in some ways, but I do have another questions to you. So, well, first I'll go with, so obviously all regions would have their own preference for local climate, while Sologeo cannot deliver that. I think what Juan mentioned actually is really nice, because I was thinking about that too, in sort of combination of different methods and more local and global. But I think in this way, having the possibility to have certain local interventions would mean that you would shift your preference, and therefore you would end up still with maybe a little bit different looking structure of the decision making, but similar asymmetric. So similar, this public good, public bad. So the more the better for some, but the more the worse for others. But I mean, deployment strategy that makes all regions better off is still realistic. Now the question is, you haven't mentioned that, I guess, because of time. So what structure do you think, what kind of decision-making process do you envision? I was thinking, so consensus or majority voting or the combination of those. And also, what would it take for effective coordination? So the way I see this, at least, majority voting purely would not really be politically feasible. There's always this minority that would, even given the quote, they would just leave the decision-making process if they would not be satisfied, or if they would not be able to find their voice being heard. And of course, it's different from other countries. You can think of quota here being vulnerability, but it's still very debatable perhaps, because everyone would want to say that to sort of increase their vulnerability, because we still cannot have a scientific consensus on that either. So, and but what I think is crucial here, well, we also have the consensus, but then consensus takes time, and when we have, so it might be not sort of efficient. So the majority rule in that way is a quicker option, while the majority can be again abused by the majority. Or sort of create even corruption, perhaps. Consensus is definitely more inclusive, but it does require a certain environment or the context of decision making. So that brings me to this question of what would be this effective coordination environment? And I would say it starts with the assessment of scientific knowledge, which I believe should be sort of decentralized, but then there sort of should be sort of platform. Like, I love that you mentioned IMF. I was in similar ways thinking about, so it's a combination of this consensus and voting rules. But at the same time, the way EASA was created to sort of connect East and West, and this collaborative environment where countries work on their own research, but then there's a platform where they can meet and sort of more deeply connect. Yeah, and so so what else is this crucial factors to create the good context or the environment for the decision making? Yeah, so I think something that emerges from the scientific collaboration and wide public engagement, of course, would be better, so establishing the trust and the relationship, and to have a more constructive conversation. While when we think about climate emergency, and I'm not talking about the emergency where we have to talk given these impulsive decisions, but really climate emergencies that draw attention to the question and sort of more strongly put a pressure from public to the governments for an action. But in this case, we may not have as much time to reach consensus, so it might be a little bit different. So I was just curious, how do you think about this environment creating? And in my view, we have to start now to talk more deeply internationally to really reach consensus, because I do find it more favorable than just majority voting group. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And Jesse, that's a lot to respond to, but I'll let you have a crack at it.
All right, great. Thanks for the opportunity to respond. Thanks to the discussants for the thoughtful comments and questions. Let's see what ground I can cover here. In not quite the order that it was presented. Juan's comment about thinking about intervention in both that it's not necessarily beneficial to think of solar geoengineering as monolithic, to think of it as a perhaps a large N phenomena. I fully agree with that, and I think that does pose some interesting questions around the decision-making process. It does change the dynamic, both on the whether and the how. The larger number of actors would create a gray area around the whether question. If it's a small actor doing a small implementation and just the number gradually increases, there's no clear line of the on and off switch, such as what I had in my presentation, to suggest a binary deployment decision. It indeed might not be like that. And it also creates an interesting challenge. It would create an interesting challenge in terms of the how question, that largely the how much, but also there's other parameters of geoengineering. Because if you imagine a bell curve distribution of preferences of the amount of cooling, then the smaller number of actors you have, the more likely that those are relatively close to the mean, to the center of the bell curve. With more players, you get more on the high end, and it's the high end that can, at the end of the day, get its way. So if we had a world with hundreds or thousands of climate engineers, so to speak, and there was a sense that maybe there's too much solar geoengineering goes, well, it's that one on the high end that would need to start, that you'd have to convince, that ends up with a type of a veto power. So that would indeed make it more challenging. This segues a bit into Dave's comment about non-state actors. I tend to be dismissive of non-state actors actually implementing solar geoengineering, because as with modest countries, it's just too much money and too much technological capacity required, even for the world's wealthiest individuals. And I do think that states will assert this as their prerogative, that they're not going to allow non-state actors within their jurisdiction to take control of the environment or to influence the climate directly. There's also no real clear direct way to profit from solar geoengineering. There's not much of a business model, in part because it's a type of a public good service in the economic sense of the term. That's not to say there would be no business interest in solar geoengineering. One could imagine a type of a procurement model in which businesses develop technology and offer services for research, development, and deployment of solar geoengineering. And that can raise some concerns around influence of policy. But I just don't see that being a primary channel of deployment. And in a way that also segues to Maria's comment about a decision-making structure. This is, how to put it, it might be more fruitful to think about what is the next step in decision-making, not necessarily the endpoint, some sort of centralized body with a voting rule in terms of yes or no, do we do it, or how intensely should we do it, but instead, what is the next logical step in international cooperation towards better and improved decision making? It's a bit of a pragmatic muddling through approach that I take, and I think her suggestion of starting with the assessment of information is ideal. I think that be it an IPCC endeavor, or for example, an institution like like IASA, which was founded with a certain not just scientific idea, but a political idea in mind, can help lay the groundwork for that. To jump around here, Juan brought up the point around, I'm going to share my screen for just a moment if I can, if you all let me share screen, about the endpoint. And I was going to include this. This is the ideal complementary roles of climate, of solar geoengineering in a portfolio of climate solutions. And here at the top, if you can see my pointer, there's sort of a business as usual emissions, which cause greenhouse gas concentrations, this is concentrations, to increase, because even reducing emissions to zero would not cause emissions to decrease. You can reduce emissions down here. The curve still goes upward because atmospheric concentrations accumulate from emissions. Carbon dioxide removal can bend the curve. And then you have solar geoengineering, ideally as a temporary measure. Ideally, we as a collective society might enter into this with an endpoint in mind. This is the sort of shaving the peak. We aim to end solar geoengineering when greenhouse gas concentrations come back down through carbon dioxide removal to whatever it is, 400 ppm, for example. And in the meantime, you have some adaptation and some impacts. But that's an ideal, of course. It's really hard to say, well, we're going to make some decisions in this year, and these will be our guidelines 100 years later. Which might turn out to be the case. We don't see ourselves now as greatly shaped by the political decisions that countries made 100 years ago, and values and goals and objectives may change. I'm going to hop here through my notes. Maria brought up the climate emergency. I'm glad she did that. I do think that there's a serious risk. One of the real risks, one of the real dangerous scenarios around solar geo implementation is the use of solar geoengineering rapidly, rashly, under a perceived climate emergency, real or otherwise, in which states and other actors, and perhaps the whole international community, perceives that the stakes are suddenly very urgent and warrant global intervention. And if the base of knowledge is not sufficient at that time, there could be real consequences. And that of course points toward the benefit of having ramping up scientific research. I think I've got two more comments. Right. So Dave asked about why do I think if there's agreement on the climate target, there's agreement on parameters, and is this different or not than greenhouse gas emissions reduction? The reason that I believe this is that there are models that for especially in the more recent work around the GLENS model, the Geoengineering Large Ensemble project, in which they optimize solar geoengineering for some target. Various papers have various targets. And they have multiple dials they can adjust, right? For example, how much aerosol would be injected at various latitudes north and south of the equator, perhaps at different times of years. And these appear to be able to achieve, for example, a cooling target such as pre-industrial or 1.5 degrees warming quite accurately. And so if one can imagine such a responsive feedback system, that if there's agreement on that parameter, on that climatic target, then the parameters of solar geoengineering appear to be an easy consequence of that. It's a little different than emissions reduction. I mean, we're aiming for 1.5 to 2 degrees C, and the amount of emissions reduction that is necessary to achieve that is so great that any sort of difference about how much that is doesn't really matter. We know we're extremely far from it. So that's a bridge I suppose we might cross when we get there. And finally, Dave asked about moral hazard, and by way of explanation, in the geoengineering world, this is the concern that the consideration of solar geoengineering will take the pressure off of states, regulators, emitters, voters from taking emissions cuts seriously. That will just keep emitting greenhouse gases, because in the back of our minds, maybe we know that solar geoengineering would save us. It raises several sub-questions, all of which I think are really hard to answer. First, would it happen? Dave mentioned that maybe there's a reverse effect in the empirical evidence to date when you do experiments, psychological experiments in games and so forth in the lab. It appears to have something of a reverse effect where solar geoengineering causes people to take climate change more seriously. But that's just, those are experiments, and what we're really worried about is decision makers in the future, and we just don't know. Second, would it matter? Would a little bit more emissions coupled with the capacity to use solar geoengineering could still result in a net reduction of risk in sort of a risk compensation scenario. So it may or may not be relevant. Third, would we know? Would we know whether whether emissions have been artificially increased? Probably not. I mean, there was a lot of concern that taking adaptation to a changed climate seriously 20 years ago, 15 years ago, would likewise cause greater emissions. Has that happened? We don't know. There's no way to know. There's no counterfactual. Fourth and finally, what could we do about it? It's really unclear what sorts of policies could reduce this moral hazard phenomena. We do know that we have to keep emissions cuts at the top of the agenda. We need to be pushing hard on that, but that should not exclude solar geoengineering research. And I'm concerned that it has excluded solar geoengineering research thus far. And with that, I'll end my response.
Thank you, Jesse. I will try to summarize a lot of the questions of our audience. We'll pose them to our panelists and key speaker. We won't be able to get through all of them. We had about 20 submitted online. We have several already right now. First, though, to backtrack before we get into the governance issues, I'll pose this to Juan. The risk, about half of the questions that were submitted before for the registration were concerned about the risks of geoengineering. So over the past several years, there's been a lot of attention paid to understanding these risks. And through some of this research, these issues are now better understood. In your view, what risks that we thought were important 10 years ago do we now think are not so important, but what risks remain as the most important to consider with solar radiation management?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer this question as much as I would like to be. I think we know a lot more about how geoengineering plays out on models of the climate. And most of the initial worries about the possible side impacts of geoengineering with respect to climatic interventions don't appear to be as large as we thought originally, but it doesn't mean that they are not there, and it doesn't mean that it's definitive. So I think initially we worried too much about the implications of geoengineering as it affects the climate. And I'm pretty sure that is still very important, but it's not my area of research. So in my area of research, I think we have seen a transition towards questions about the risk of actually implementing, which is what Jesse was discussing today. So how do we implement that? What other consequences have when you actually implement something like geoengineering, let's say, on the economy and society and cultural impacts? So I think I can talk specifically about two. I think one was the impacts of geoengineering on health. For example, there have been research on that and shows that actually it's very small relative to what we thought in terms of like actual sulfur dioxide falling from the sky. For many reasons, it's not risky. There are some natural science reasons also, because we are assuming we're going to put sulfur dioxide, which is not necessarily what we're going to be doing. And the other one that we were worried about initially was the impacts on the climate, on the vegetation and things like that. And then just giving like small examples, because there has been a lot of fantastic research at the beginning. There were like this set of large questions that Alan Robock put, have like 20 reasons why not to do it. And people have been very judiciously going after them and finding that really none of those, the ones that have been researched on, there have not been actual consequences in models of geoengineering. But I think even if we, from my perspective, we figure out all the risk from the natural science perspective, we still have to deal with all the risks that are just because of society way to implement and deal with things is weird, and we're humans. Yeah. Sorry, I cannot give like a succinct.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Juan. I guess I'll follow up on part two of that question to either Maria or Dave or both of you. When the statement is made that geoengineering is, quote, too risky, the follow-up might be too risky in comparison to what? And Jesse mentioned these risk trade-offs and comparisons. How would you, maybe from an economics perspective, how would you compare the risks of a world where we address climate change with mitigation, carbon dioxide removal, adaptation, economic development? Compare that world with a world where we also have the tool of solar radiation management. How do you compare the risks of those two futures?
Dave, do you want to go?
Well, thank you. My position on the risks of solar geoengineering, at this point, I don't know enough. And working, I'm kind of entering this line of research fairly recently, and I'm a behavioral economist. Use experiments to look at decision making, often under uncertainty or often under risk. And so, what I'm trying to get my head around are what are these risks, or what are the side effects, and I think that the need for research and the need for not just the social science research, but scientific research on this is paramount. I mean, this is what is needed, because I don't think that we can compare the kind of known risks that we might have with the climate change or mitigation, even adaptation, that it has been mentioned that 20, 30 years ago, we kind of looked at adaptation in the same light. But we have I think there's a better grasp at that. And so I'm kind of curious of Jesse and the other discussants of their thoughts on what these risks are, and do we have a handle on, especially these side effects, of solar geoengineering.
Yeah, I can maybe add a little bit here. So when I think about risk of solar geo versus the risk of climate change itself, it's inherently different risks, because in terms of solar geo, we choose it, and climate change is what we get. So we can do everything we can to reduce this, but it's a given risk that we are trying to reduce. While in case of solar geo, we can use it in a way to sort of choose the right strategy to lower the inherent risks of solar geo with what it looks for now, of course, relative to climate impacts, projected climate impacts, solar does look pretty good, that the side effects are very low, and also just the fact that you can choose a moderate level of solar GU that would reduce risks, in fact.
Great, thank you. Jesse, did you have anything to add to that? And then I have one question for you after that.
No, nothing to, well, maybe one quick thought to add directly, going after what Maria said about we choose to undertake solar geoengineering. It seems to me that we hold the risks and possible consequences of solar geoengineering to a higher standard than we do when we compare them to the possible consequences of climate change, because we do it intentionally. Now, I think there is a good argument for doing so. I don't know whether I necessarily hold that argument, but from an ethical perspective, that the consequences of an intentional action are different than the expected consequences of an unintentional action. I'm not so sure, but I think that is the type of serious conversation that needs to take place within the solar geoengineering discourses. Are these apples and apples? Are the consequences of climate change that we're trying to reduce, should we put them on the same footing as the consequences of solar geoengineering?
All right, Jesse, there's a lot of questions related to the free driver effect. Maybe you could touch on that, and this notion of non-cooperative, non-coordinated implementation. I'm wondering about this tension between whether the governance of solar geoengineering is more a question of maybe ideally technocratic management versus one of national and international security. I think we'd all prefer the former. And the proposal you lay out in your book of a, quote, a solar geoengineering organization would help preserve this, especially with mechanisms for non-proliferation and monitoring to strengthen a norm of cooperation. One question is, what happens when the norm of non-first use is broken? First, what do other states do in response? And in preparation for that, is one idea possibly to bring in the UN Security Council at an earlier date, at an earlier stage in the process?
Yeah. So, so we can sort of paint out a couple of different scenarios along this. So earlier I said that we don't really know states, the distribution of states' preferences. How broad is this distribution space around their preferences, both on the intensity of solar geoengineering as well as their sentiment on whether it should be used, as well as this idea about how strong is the intensity of this preference. If we assume, just for the sake of one scenario of strong and divergent preferences, right? This is the difficult scenario. How do we govern this? And there's a norm of non-use among states, a sort of a non-first strike use, to use the analogy from nuclear weapons. And then a state acts against this. That could go a number of different ways. If the state does so, can do so with sufficient legitimacy, if this is a climate vulnerable state and it declares itself at risk in international law, that its act is necessary, which means that it's not responsible for acts that might be contrary to international law, that act can carry sufficient legitimacy that it shifts the norm. It creates a new norm. That the norm of non-first use is shifted. There could also be a retaliatory scenario where other states intervene to rein in the state and end its action, or there could be one of ongoing tension, in which deployment continues, and there's a sense of disagreement in the international community, but that can be difficult to resolve, which then leads us to the UN Security Council, which, legally it can address any issue related to, I think it's international peace and security is how it's phrased, and that's a broad enough concept that that I think it would be pretty easy to bring discussions of solar geoengineering into this. And I think at the end of the day, the Security Council is sort of like a backstop, right? If there's international disagreement about a serious issue, it ends up falling on the Security Council, and specifically on the 5 members, on the 5 permanent members, which have the veto authority. And these are more or less the superpowers, the hegemons, and a couple of other relatively powerful states. And there it requires unanimity. And that remains to be seen. You could have international political power politics playing out in a way that's not necessarily sincere, in which states are using an issue as not necessarily because that's their direct preference, but as a way to project power on other states, right? So to give you an example, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council none of them are particularly vulnerable to climate change. So they're not the ones that first come to mind in terms of potentially driving solar geoengineering. But a country like China, which is a future superpower on the rise, could use solar geoengineering, even intentionally contrary to the norm of no first use, as a means of projecting power, as a way of saying, see, this is the type of stuff we can get away with, and you can't stop us, including because we have a seat on the Security Council.
Well, great. Continuing on that theme of existing international institutions, I'd like to throw it open to all of our panelists and Jesse as well. The UNFCCC's role, how do you see it? Is it well placed to address solar geoengineering questions? Relatedly, the IPCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientific advisory body. Other existing organizations, how well placed are they to address solar geoengineering questions, or to what extent do we need new either organizations or new multilateral treaties?
Shall I take the lead on this and then
Sure.
Get some responses? Sure. My sentiment around the UNFCCC is sort of a two-sided. On the one hand, they are the international body, it's the international institution. It's a treaty with parties to it, and a fairly minimal institutional infrastructure that's charged with climate change issues. And it's kind of difficult to see a long-term international, if not global process around solar geoengineering that does not include the UNFCCC at a fairly central level. At the same time, in the short term, I think it's very poorly placed to take the lead on these issues. Up until now, it's noticeably avoided even considering any aspect of solar geoengineering, and that's not surprising. The discussions there over even the smallest minutia for which you would hope there's international consensus get drawn out. A number of states see it as something of a dysfunctional body, and from a legal perspective, it's not within the purview, the objective of the original UNFCCC agreement, which is about stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a bit of a two-sided answer. In the long run, it needs to be central. In the short term, I have a hard time imagining leadership. The IPCC, on the other hand, I think is in a position where it can and should take some action in this space, because what's lacking in solar geoengineering is sort of an internationally agreed upon baseline of knowledge, particularly regarding modeling and the natural sciences. What could this do? What might be the climatic impacts of biodiversity, of solar geoengineering, and likewise secondary effects on things such as biodiversity, stratospheric ozone, etc. It's just not there. And as the IPCC is now, such information ends up getting scattered across chapters, and I get the sense there's kind of some foot dragging on within the IPCC on taking it seriously. So what I'd really like to see is a special report from the IPCC in the next cycle, which would end up having it come out around 2025, 2026 or so, which is not soon, but it's probably the best we can get. And that's the type of thing that could really move the international conversation forward.
But if I could just add a couple things to jump in, I think what was interesting to think about is the type of treaty that that this would require and how it could differ from the types of treaties that we've been trying to hammer away at for emissions abatement last decades. But and one interesting difference is that while the emissions abatement is kind of this summation formation type global public good, the game theorists typically look at this geoengineering as a best shot or single best effort, which requires a different construction of a treaty and enforcement of that treaty. It could be easier, and especially if there's a agreed upon target like Jesse was mentioning, or it's kind of the flip side of that, where it's the weakest link if there's an agreement not to engage in this. And so I think that while all of these treaties and agreements fall under the purview of the UNFCCC, I mean this I would think that this would too, but it would have to take it would be different in nature, I think, to an agreement on emissions abatement.
We have several questions asking about hypothetical future scenarios. Obviously, there's a multitude of them and too many to consider, but I guess to follow on Jesse's framework in his book, where you lay out considerations for small-scale research, stage 2 is large-scale research, stage 3 is implementation. What sort of scenarios do you all think are the most important to pay attention to in terms of managing the risk? So we had one questioner about, in terms of small-scale research, worried about a non-state actor pursuing geoengineering research that has negative environmental side effects. At the scale of implementation, we have another question about a scenario where China uses solar geoengineering, quote, on behalf of several African countries as a humanitarian gesture with the backing of other African countries. Obviously, there are too many scenarios to consider, but what sort of scenarios maybe at one of those three stages do you think that we should pay most attention to? Or there are probably so many to consider.
So let me add something here. I think when we think of scenarios, we actually are not thinking wide enough about this. We usually think of scenarios that involve some amount of mitigation, and then we wonder, hey, how do we end up using geoengineering? I think I'm more interested in the scenarios where the obvious need for cooling the planet is there. So we're already at 4 degrees and we forget about how we got there. Yeah. So we forget about how we got to the 4 degrees, 5 degrees. And you have my kids or my grandkids making this decision. And I would like to know the scenarios that actually puts us there, because we're too attached to our past, our recent past. And we still feel like, hey, we screw up the planet, so we should do something that is not just putting more stuff in the atmosphere. But when you're facing as a poor country or as a future generation, you're facing the question of like, how are we gonna make this a livable planet? I think our decision process will change, or their decision process will change substantially. So in that scenario, I think you have China doing it for other people. You have many small interventions happening. And it's easier to think as once you stop thinking about the the reason why the planet got where it was there. So I think scenarios that are detached from our current place or how we got here are going to allow us to think better about the future. This is not to say which scenario is more important, but I think we haven't been thinking enough about the scenarios in which we don't have mitigation, and scenarios in which we just got to 5, 6 degrees and now what? And I think those scenarios look very different to the scenarios we have now. They're cringeworthy, and we don't want to think about those. But who cares about what we want? No, is what the research needs to do.
Okay, bringing it to current affairs, we have a question about COVID. In your opinion, what are some of the key lessons learned from 2020 in terms of how multiple actors have responded and managed, well or not, the emerging risks of COVID? And how could these lessons be applied to solar radiation management governance?
I'll dive in with a couple. These are not well thought out, so with that as a caveat, the two that come to mind are first, the power of a sense of emergency. I touched on this earlier, following off of Maria's comment. Of all the scenarios of future solar geoengineering that worry me the most, it's probably the so-called emergency use scenario, where it's done in haste with a poor knowledge base due to the perception of severe climate impacts caused by greenhouse gas emissions. So I think one lesson from COVID is that shouldn't be underestimated, because we've seen an unprecedented change in global society. We've never seen anything like this, where everybody on the planet started to behave quite differently in a fairly short amount of time because of this perceived sense of emergency. The second thing that comes to mind is I've remained pleasantly surprised, despite some pushback, in the general trust in experts worldwide. This dramatic change in individual behavior with widespread social and serious economic consequences from dialing back human activity has been the result of the advice of epidemiologists and other scientists. And I think that it's a bit of a counter to the narrative that we're living in some sort of age of deep rejection of expertise. Yeah, on the margins, there is some rejection, and I think it manifests occasionally in some unpleasant ways. But for the most part, I think it's stronger than we thought.
I would also add to that the surprising amount, perhaps, of misinformation. And it's happening also all over the world. But so what I mostly personally observe is what happens in the US by high leaders just giving wrong information, but also in Russia, where we have quite like officials providing wrong information that we might inherently be immune, because during Soviet times we had a wide range of vaccines that some of them might sort of cross like have this cross effect with COVID, and a lot of people get sick and a lot of people die, and yeah, so I think misinformation is a danger, and it's really the role of media here. Yeah, well, it's been interesting to see the spread, and sometimes it seems obvious to some sort of facts being questioned, and I think the level of this misinformation is a bit higher than what we would want it to be.
To follow up on that, I could imagine, hypothetically, a leader of a developed country that is so self-assured or not narcissistic that it's possible this person would want to single-handedly solve the climate problem. And I, you know, COVID has kind of brought some of that maybe behavior more to the forefront, where this is a possibility to entertain.
I actually been thinking about this, and I still don't have a cogent answer to the relation with COVID. I think the things in the context of geoengineering that have I learned from COVID is that the notion of an emergency means nothing if you're not prepared. And if there is an actual, there are two ways. No, there is no emergency with deployed geoengineering, that's bad. But suppose there is actually an emergency and we agree on the fact that solar geoengineering is actually a viable option. These are big ifs, so don't take me as advocating for any of this stuff. Even in that situation, what I have learned is that the world is not ready to actually act, that we don't know how to do this. We didn't know how to stop the pandemics, and pandemics are super complicated, and assuming that the climate change is going to be less complicated than pandemic is wrong. So I think if anything, we're going to be in a worse place. We're not going to know how to do it, and that lack of coherent action by international community in the face of an actual emergency gives me pause about geoengineering. Not in that we're going to use it too much, it's because maybe we're not going to use it enough. You know, like we're not going to be ready if we need it. And the other thing that I learned is, and that COVID has made very clear, is that climate change impacts and geoengineering impacts are not going to be felt equally across society. And what COVID has shown us is that there is the impacts are disproportionate on the poor, on the minorities, on the marginal communities. And we don't think about that enough. Our policy decisions and our interventions are not meant to minimize the suffering of the most vulnerable. If we're lucky, we're trying to minimize the suffering of the person in the middle, but the reality, what we have learned, is that we just want to minimize the suffering of those that are at the top. And that is not going to play out well. And if we make our geoengineering decisions thinking that way, we're going to have billions of people that are going to be worse off just because we want to benefit the few. So I think this COVID has made very real this concept that we all had on climate change, that climate change is going to be impacting some countries more than others, and that the poor. But this is very clear. This is very clear that we have not done it properly. That is the other thing that we learned, is that we have not addressed the COVID from a justice perspective the way we should have done it. Again, another motive to give me pause. So I haven't learned anything positive from COVID.
Well, I guess some pessimistic and optimistic notes to leave us. The pessimistic non-lesson from Juan, and also the remaining optimism from Jesse, and I guess from me also, and the faith or the belief in science. It reminds me of that. I'm paraphrasing the famous lines from the Royal Society report in 2009 that you know, that the main challenges with geoengineering won't necessarily be in terms of engineering and technology and natural science, but what will be in the social science realm, political, ethical, economic, and related ones. I'd like to thank all of our guests. This is a great conversation. Thank you very much, Jesse Reynolds, Juan Reiner Cruz, Dave McAvoy, Maria Belaya. We appreciate this. We will have this we will have this recorded video on our website at the Duke Center on Risk, and we'll be in touch with future seminars. So thank you all, and thank you to the audience members.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.